Great. Welcome, everyone. This is really exciting. We're going to talk for a little bit. We're going to have our keynote session, and then we have a whole hour just to chat and have food, and then we'll feed into our panel. So I promise there will be lots of time for coffee and some good networking. But first, we're going to do some introductions and just kind of set the stage for what really brought us all together today. So I just want to start off with a land acknowledgement, and this is one that was delivered by Dr. Malcolm King, one of my colleagues, back in November, and is shared with his permission. On a national level, we encourage all Canadians and those of you who are visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands in which they live, work, and visit, and become engaged allies together. We as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, and their rights and responsibilities in culture, language, and the pursuit of wellness. And today we are here, lots of you from a whole bunch of different places in Canada, but we are in Toronto, which for thousands of years has been the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And this meeting place is still the home today to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we're really grateful to have the opportunity to spend some time here in Toronto, and hopefully some of you get a chance to celebrate with some of the ongoing celebrations in Toronto this weekend, because there's lots of great things to celebrate here in this beautiful place. So just a few disclosures. I'm going to talk about what C4T is today. So if you're like, oh, that sounds really fancy, it's not. It's just our academic research team, but I am the scientific director. I do sit on the board of directors for the Canadian Consortium for the Investigation of Cannabinoids, which is our academic expert group here in Canada. I did sit on the health products containing cannabinoids and scientific advisory board at Health Canada, and I hold a variety of academic funding, none of which is related to what I'm going to talk about today. But the reason that this meeting is happening and that we have lunch and are able to partner with ICRS in this way is because of some of our funding organizations. So thanks to them for supporting this work. So why are we here? So really I had three goals of bringing this group together, and by partnering and trying to expand it outside of our ongoing group, to share a little bit of very quick update. I'm going to talk for like 10 minutes about what C4T has been up to, not because it's not a lot, but because we have lots available online and there's lots of really other great voices I want to feature today. We want to create a safe space. We're going to share different perspectives, and you'll see from our panel, they were intentionally selected to bring different, both geographical, but also clinical expertise to this discussion around the future of cannabinoid therapeutics in children. And finally, to have a discussion really with all of you of how do we move this space forward and how can we collaborate together. So a huge thank you, and I see they're now joining us in the room, to ICRS, who really, this was an international pediatric meeting, was on our 2024 vision board, and the opportunity of having CCIC and ICRS here in Toronto really we had to capitalize on that. And so thanks for trusting us to put on a good meeting and for helping getting this organized. And if any of you have ever worked with C4T, you've met one or both of these two wonderful humans who really none of this would happen without. And so a huge thank you to Zena and Sophia and Chris, who is managing the online part. And I didn't have a good headshot of you, so maybe that's something we can work on for next year. But thank you. He's from U of M and he supports all of our tech. And when I say that they really support me, I messaged them on Thursday in the morning and asked them to make me a poster. And then lo and behold, less than 24 hours later, I get this picture, and Zena printed our awesome poster out there. So seriously, thank you to you both. So, because this is an international meeting and there are some folks here that aren't from Canada and some folks joining us online, I thought I'd talk a little bit just about the landscape here in Canada before we dive in, because a lot of our experience is here in Canada. So in Canada, we have kind of three buckets. So we have cannabis-based pharmaceuticals. So those are your Nabalones, your Sativex. They have drug identification numbers. They can be prescribed. They can be submitted for reimbursement, used in hospitals, etc. You have medical cannabis. So that is through the medical cannabis stream. It's governed under the Cannabis Act. These are products that are made to GPP standards. So pharmaceuticals have to be to GMP standards, like all pharmaceutical drugs. Medical cannabis and recreational cannabis here in Canada is made to GPP standards. And of course, there's a wide variety of products available in Canada, ranging from CBD oils to THC concentrates and a whole bunch of products in between. And so cannabis-based pharmaceutical, like I said, we don't have Epidiolex available here in Canada. So when you hear a lot of our Canadian experiences in pediatrics, Children with epilepsy here don't have access to Epidiolex. And so I just thought I'd walk through just quickly, like why that makes it challenging and kind of why C4T, some of the challenges that we've encountered and try to address at C4T. So there's no Epidiolex here. And so for children with drug-resistant epilepsy or other indications, that means they get a medical cannabis authorization. Otherwise, it is illegal for them to possess any cannabis, as cannabis is illegal for those who are under the age of 18 or 19, depending on where you live. So they get access to GPP products through the medical cannabis stream that is regulated by the cannabis branch. Problem is that clinical trials are regulated in a different place. So clinical trials are regulated under the Office of Clinical Trials, and they require us to study products that are made to GMP. So the products that pediatric patients are accessing are not the products that we can actually study. And this is because they're actually regulated separately. And even though Health Canada, who I know is in the room today, it falls under the same institution, these are different branches of that institution that actually mandate these requirements. And there hasn't necessarily been a bridge between them to support clinical trials here in Canada. And so C4T really came together to address some of these challenges and how do we build good trials? How do we work with companies and make good products? And so C4T is an academic research team. It sounds like maybe a fancy center or some kind of charity. We're not. It is an academic group that just sort of snowballed into what it is. People have asked me how I started this, and I don't even really have a good answer. But we've grown. And so we had our first meeting at Sick Kids in 2019. And so it's been, next year was going to be our 5-year anniversary. And it's grown to 107 members. And so not all of them show up every month to listen to updates and guest speakers, but about 30 people, 20 to 30 people do come every month, and we have feature a guest and talk about our studies. And so it is mostly physicians and scientists here in Canada, although there are some international members, and certainly you'd be welcome to join us. We do require everyone submit a conflict of interest statement. And so that is something that's very important to us. Obviously, anyone who does have financial benefit from cannabinoid companies or cannabis-based investments is not invited to attend our monthly meetings. And obviously we do that to protect our interests and reduce bias. And so we have a website. And like I said, I'm not going to share too much about our research because there's a lot of it, but it's mostly posted online. And so we have a lot of different studies, qualitative studies, clinical trials, and kind of everything in between. We have a parent and youth advisory group. We have a steering committee. And something that was really important to us was to have key opinion leaders at each hospital, somewhere pediatricians could go to ask questions and get support and try and get connected with someone who might have an answer on how to help that patient in front of them. And so I'm pleased to say almost every single pediatric hospital has a key opinion leader, someone who can just connect them to us and help try and answer questions. So when I say that there's a lot of research, there really is a lot, and it's not all led by me. We have plenty of working groups who sort of self-do their own things. But there's a couple of things I wanted to highlight, which is really our patient and clinician caregiver surveys. These are in pediatric oncology. Some of our barriers and some of our regulatory reform work, which we kind of got into by accident, really, when we thought we were going to do clinical trials. And sort of learning about some of the challenges families are facing. And I'll talk a bit about some of our clinical trials that are planned and under review. So first thing I want to share a little bit about is here in Canada, what is the perspective of patients and their caregivers as well as clinicians on medical cannabis products in pediatric children with cancer. And so this first paper is a local paper that was published by one of our pediatric oncologists in Winnipeg. And this looks at our pediatric cancer care Manitoba pediatric clinic. So there's 64 patients who completed this survey, and 22% of them were using cannabis products. And so this is really small and hard to read, but essentially what we can see is that there were some diversity in what types of cancer these patients had. Most of them were more than 6 months since diagnosis, and most of them were on active treatment that were using cannabis products. So that's kind of where we saw a difference in terms of who was using cannabis and who wasn't. It was more likely to be those on active treatment, which we kind of think makes sense if they're using cannabis for symptom management. We looked at the reasons they were using cannabis, and again, most of them said kind of a combination of symptom management and as an anti-cancer treatment. And some of the other reasons were things like, made them feel good, it was recreational use, to manage their mood, etc. Many of them were getting cannabis still from their friends. And so this was done post-legalization in Canada. And some from a dispensary, some from prescription. And what was concerning, I think, and a little bit surprising was that still 50% reported inhaling cannabinoids, which typically in pediatrics and in epilepsy, you think of like oil products. So to see that there were still quite a few inhaling cannabinoids was a little bit maybe surprising to us. And most patients reported spending about up to $500 a month on these products. And so we asked them how it made them feel, what made things better, what made things worse, and how they felt afterwards. And again, they all reported benefit. 100% of these patients reported feeling better after starting cannabis products. And so, this is a signal of something that we really do need to investigate. And many of them did not report much symptom worsening, as you can see in the orange bars there. And so we also have clinicians, and this is the work led by my colleague in Winnipeg, Dr. Sapna Oberoi, who's at Cancer Care Manitoba. And she asked 122 of the pediatric oncologists in Canada. And if you know surveys, that's a darned good response rate. I think it was like 47%. So it really is actually quite a good picture of how pediatric oncologists in Canada feel and how their knowledge is about medical cannabis. And so 92% of them, this was not surprising, are providing care to children who are using cannabis products within the last 6 months. And again, there's not really a prescription CBD. So these are all through the medical cannabis stream or through the recreational market or through whatever means they're accessing cannabis. And 57% of them were providing care to a child who was using it as an anti-cancer treatment. And that's where, it's kind of that line is fuzzy over where families are using cannabis probably for both, likely to manage symptoms, but likely also with always the hope that it's going to alleviate their cancer. And so you can see some of the perceived benefits. And again, these are clinicians. So these are pediatric oncologists and palliative care physicians in Canada. And you can see that most of them actually perceive high to moderate effectiveness for nausea, for cachexia, and even for pain. But if you look at the treatment of cancer, you will see that blue bar, which is not effective. So for the most part, most oncologists here in Canada do not believe that cannabis products are effective for anti-cancer treatment. And just my last kind of data I wanted to share was looking at where, these patients were. They were not all receiving palliative. We looked at how they perceived cannabis use, whether these kids were on active treatment or getting palliative care. And you can see that shift into childhood cancer survivors where they don't feel like cannabis is beneficial, but you can see that there was actually always or somewhat beneficial for those actually in treatment and receiving palliative care. And this kind of aligns with using cannabis sort of in a symptom management fashion. We asked, of course, what are your concerns? What are your challenges? Uncertain benefits, no evidence, how do we dose these products? How do we select them? Concerns about abuse, concerns about problematic cannabis use, who's likely to develop this, how do we manage it, how do we diagnose it, and lack of child-friendly formulations. So just a couple of key things before I move on is that, this is happening. 92%, pretty much all of the oncologists are caring for patients that are using cannabis for some reason. And so almost all of the physicians said they want to increase their knowledge. And 2/3 of them actually identified a role for cannabis. So we really do need to study this in a rigorous way. And I'll talk about our trial in pediatric oncology, which is on its 48-hour review right now. So keep your fingers crossed. And in terms of children, about, a quarter of them were reporting that they're using cannabis. And so this really does need to be something that we think about in oncology. I'm not going to talk too much about the regulatory barriers, because if you live in Canada, you've probably heard about them before, but we've now, we started this group to do clinical trials, and we've sort of swung into this regulatory space. And so we have published 2 articles now on the barriers I described, and I'm not going to talk about them. I'm just going to share this graph that looks at some of the barriers, which are a lack of evidence, which I've talked about, why it's so hard to do clinical trials, that mismatch between what we can study and what patients are using. The lack of education. In medical school, there's 1 hour of cannabinoids taught in Med 2, and then the rest is kind of like hope for the best, right? So this is something now in Canada, we know so many people are using cannabis-based products. There's so much potential for adverse drug reactions that physicians need education. They need to be comfortable and confident in actually having these discussions with families. The prohibitive costs, and we can talk about that all panel long, about how much some of these CBD products cost for families, and product shortages, which here in Canada, they don't actually get notified if a product is going to just like stop coming. So if that's your epilepsy medication and then it just, they don't have it anymore. Oh, okay, great. Well, thanks for letting us know. Now we have to try and find a similar product. And anyways, lots of challenges, but I do think some potential facilitators as well. So the most exciting part and why we got into this, 5 years ago, was to do these clinical trials and really try and fill some of that evidence gap. And the first place is around chronic headaches in adolescents. This comes from one of my colleagues, who many of you will know, who was using Sativex on a Q-tip on the adolescent's cheek with chronic daily migraine, like someone who was not going to school, had failed 5 treatments, had failed psychotherapy, physiotherapy, someone who was living in darkness, like couldn't function at all, and put a tiny bit of Sativex on their cheek. And like the next week was in school and like attending social events. And he's like, what's happening? Like, it can't be, is this placebo? Like, and so a few people started talking and we said, oh, wait, you're seeing this effects and these people are reporting this effects, that we really need to study this for chronic daily headaches. And so this is a trial looking at those with chronic migraine who have failed more than 3 treatments. These are treatment-resistant chronic migraine patients who are adolescents, and we have, like I said, our IP is on site. So we're actually dropped off our site kit, and our local PI will actually be here a little bit later today if you want to talk about the trial. But this is a high CBD product. It's a single arm, it's a tolerability trial, and it's funded by the Sick Kids Foundation. And we're looking at adverse events. It really is a tolerability trial of, does this product, is it safe to give in these doses? What's the adverse event profile? And then what are the benefits? So we're going to look at things like headache-free days and pain-free days. And we have goal attainment scaling. So the youth who actually co-developed this study, you get to set your goal in the trial, which I think is really unique, and they get to monitor their progress towards their own goals, which was a way that was really important for us to encourage youth to track their progress in the trial. And so this trial recruits in BC, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. And as I mentioned, this trial was co-designed with youth. And so we actually used this example to publish. And I think Trim might talk a little bit about it in the panel. So I don't want to share all of their good work with this study, but I just wanted to say that, youth are very capable at making some helpful materials. And the study will be going live, like I said, in hopefully just a couple of weeks. And our pediatric oncology trial, which is the other trial we have funded currently, which is funded by the Canadian Cancer Society and CIHR, has 3 arms. Again, this is also a tolerability trial because we sort of did that survey thinking like, oh, good, everyone will be using like one product. They'll like give us a clear idea of dosing and where to start. And that was not the case at all. People are using products ranging from suppositories to oils and all kinds of different doses and combinations. And so we said we should probably study a few different things. So we're studying a high CBD 25:1, a 5:1, and a 1:1. And I'll show you the design in a moment, because the question then became, well, how much THC? Where do we start? Where do we end? And how do we get there? And so these also are oil products, and there's 20 kids in each arm across sites in BC, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. And again, we're looking at adverse events, and we're looking for signals of benefit. Is that in nausea? Is that in appetite? Is that in sleep? Is that in pain? Where are they seeing benefit? And we can use that then to power a placebo-controlled clinical trial, right? No one should be making decisions based on small tolerability studies, but it really is a start for us actually getting evidence to inform the design of a phase 3 trial. And so this trial, just before I turn it over to Elizabeth, you can't really see the bottom, but is designed in 2 phases, because we're essentially going to start the 2 arms that are high CBD and see how it goes and see how they tolerate those lower amounts of THC before we open that 1:1 arm. And we're calculating what's called the max dose 30. So we're looking at the dose at which less than 30% of participants report any adverse effects or dose limiting adverse effects. And then we'll randomize them 1:1 to 2, because we have a inkling in what parents report wanting more THC. And so we know that 1:1 arm is really important to the families for us to open. So we're just trying to build a little bit of comfort and evidence to support where we set that maximum. But right now we have it set no higher than 30 milligrams. And it could be set less than that, depending on what we learn in those first 20 patients. So back to our goals for today. Like I said, I just kind of wanted to give a whirlwind highlight of some of the work that's going on with C4T, but really the evidence is evolving, and we hope to be a part of that evolving evidence, but there's so much to do. And so there's lots of room for collaboration, and I think global collaboration, because as we've connected, and I think, our colleagues in Australia will talk a little bit about their experience getting clinical trials going. And so I think, there's lots of work to be shared, but also lots of opportunities to work together. And so I hope I will have our panel discussion, which will be for Each of our panel members are going to give short 10-minute presentations about their perspective. So they all bring a different perspective, and then we'll have a discussion and then a farewell, and then the ICRS desk and registration will open later tonight. So welcome back, and glad you could all stick around and spend your Saturday with us, because this is really the exciting part of bringing together an international audience, is hearing different perspectives. And so not only different perspectives from different countries, but also from different clinical areas. As we know, pediatric and child health there's lots of different specialties that play a big role in caring for these kiddos. And so it's great to have some different perspectives at the table today. So I have the job of introducing all of the panelists. So I asked each of them to give a really short 10-minute presentation about their different perspectives about medical cannabis and cannabis-based therapeutics, except for Elizabeth, because we already heard her perspective. And then we'll go into a discussion. And so we have some questions that have been sent in and some questions that we've generated, and you're welcome to ask any questions that you would like as well. So our first speaker is Alison. So Alison Bowers is a registered children's nurse from the United Kingdom and registered general nurse in Australia. She currently works as a research fellow in the Cancer and Palliative Care Outcomes Center within the Center for Healthcare Transformation at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. Her research is focused on pediatric palliative care, and she has a particular interest in health services research, large data, and medical cannabis. Alison currently leads a team conducting a research project involving a needs analysis and gap analysis in the delivery of the palliative care program across Australia. And she is the chief investigator and project manager for a medical cannabis clinical trial, which is how our paths crossed several years ago. She's an associate investigator and the project manager for an evaluation of the Queensland Pediatric Palliative Care collaboration. So welcome, Alison.
I just firstly like to thank Lauren and the CPAL team today for the opportunity to join you all and speak on my sort of experiences of medicinal cannabis research. I'd also just like to acknowledge the Lambert Initiative and also QUT, who have all supported me, and as well as CPAL with funding to be able to be here today. Just to confirm, I am from Australia, even though I do have the British accent. So not to be confused, I do represent Australia with this presentation today. Sorry, we're not advancing on the screen. Or oh, there we go, we're working again. So I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands that we meet today, and extend that acknowledgement to any Indigenous people joining us here in the room or online. I come from Brisbane, Australia, which is the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people. So pediatric medicinal cannabis research. I kind of fell into this role, as I was discussing earlier at breakfast, whereas I actually offered to help a clinician set up his application for a medical research future fund. And although I have a clinical research background, I'd never worked in medicinal cannabis before, but clinician busy, so I offered to help him set it up. And lo and behold, here I am now as the clinical trial coordinator. On top of my other research activities, which Lauren mentioned earlier. So when you initially set up a clinical trial, it looks very streamlined, something like this. You find your grant opportunity, you do your application, it's successful, you write your protocol, your ethics governance, you write your SOPs, you implement, away you go. Seems pretty straightforward, but I'm sure as anybody who's done a clinical trial, that's not quite the case. Lots of things to consider. These are just some of sort of the main things. You've got your registrations and things like that. You're writing your pharmacy manual has been a huge task for our doctor who actually wrote it. Ethics and governance, you've got your case report form. So you've got, you take sort of that research idea that you're putting on your grant, and you have to develop a protocol. And it's not really until you start developing a protocol that you start to ask questions of the research team as to how are we actually going to do this, and in reality, when we operationalize this, what's going to happen. And then you sort of find that there's probably lots of questions that perhaps haven't been thought out in as much detail, because at the time you weren't really sure if you were going to get the grant or not, and now you've got it, you've got to deliver the project. And this is where you get sort of a lot of trial add-ons, because people come up with lots of ideas about things that perhaps you could also do now they've started thinking about it. And you kind of have to say, well, that wasn't in our proposal. That's not what we need to be doing, but this is a great opportunity to do it. So why don't we add that on? You do get add-ons before and after ethics and governance approval. So then you do lots of amendments in between before you can recruit your first patient. And within that, everything else changes. So your standard operating procedures, you can have standard operating procedures, which, as they say, should be standard across the clinical trial. What actually happens is when you're working with different sites, with us, you end up with standard operation procedures that are site specific. Having to work around the different ways that different sites and hospitals operate, even within Australia, has been a bit of a challenge, so that we're all sort of on the same page, checking in with people. If we use this tube or we do it this way, how will it affect our results, to obviously make sure that it is standardized where possible. Feedback from others, as I say, is a great thing. Lots of people have great ideas. Some things you don't want them to be hearing about, and you don't want them to be telling you at the point you're at where you're ready to start. We are actually on ethics amendment number 3 and have not recruited our first patient yet, just because of the feedback we have been getting from others. Some has been helpful, and others we've decided, we'll do that in the next trial. So you start off and you have this bit of a wobbly ride where you think, it's not quite straightforward, and it's a bit windy and a bit wobbly, but there's this sort of blackness of you don't really know what's going to come next from out of all these sort of different aspects you need to discuss. And then you end up with this. So this is Anthony Herbert's analogy of what it's like to set up a clinical trial, which is it's his first clinical trial to set up. So it becomes a bit of a marathon, sort of that straightforward process, a bit of a wobbly road, but it actually turns out to be a marathon. And we like this sort of analogy because it's very long. It takes much longer than you think it's going to take when you set out. And then you hit Heartbreak Hill. So for many reasons. And for those that aren't familiar with Heartbreak Hill, it's a steep half-mile uphill at mile 20. So you're almost at the end and then you just hit this hill. And that's what our clinical trial has pretty much been like. We thought we were smooth sailing. We were on the home run and then we hit this hill. And the hill was hit because of, I guess, other areas that you have to work with to get your trial up and running. So sort of like pharmacy pathology, trying to get licenses for surveys and questionnaires to use for your trial again has taken months. And I had a very long discussion with one of our pathology providers to ask them to provide some sample tubes and things that we needed. And 6 months later, after I put in 2 quote requests, they told me they can't actually supply them. So then you have to go back to square one and find a new provider. So it's these kind of things that you come across with setting up your trial. Because it's, even though you're trying to do it, there's so many other departments and organizations that need to be involved. The other aspect, and the reason why we like this, because after running our marathon, Anthony and I now play table tennis, because we have this back and forth with different organizations where we send them something and we think they're done, but they send it back. And then we send it back to them again. Oh no, they want to send it back and get some more questions. An example of this is the Australia-New Zealand Clinical Trial Registry, who sent some questions back from our registration because we hadn't quite addressed some things that they needed. So we sent that back. But then they sent it back to us again because there was another question we hadn't addressed. But rather than tell us in the first email we hadn't addressed multiple questions, they decided to send them to us one by one every time somebody else reviewed it. So you come across these other masters of ping pong who start hitting this ball back to you with even more force. So you have to almost just keep pushing through, and you do get to the point where you're kind of like, I really don't think I can do this anymore. Because it gets to the point for us, it's been a bit of a joke, a long-standing joke, especially getting the some of the questionnaires, the license agreements has been a very long 12-month battle for a service, shall we say, that we already got within a few months for a previous study we were doing. So I think one of the things you have to accept with a clinical trial is you can have this timeline, but delays happen, and they can be administrative requirements. So we've had to go through university and things like that, approvals. I can honestly say that the ethics and governance process has been the quickest and easiest thing, which a lot of people I know can sort of hit those those roadblocks there, but our ethics went straight through. There was no problems. Our ethics board was familiar with medicinal cannabis prescribing because it's also used in other studies at our centre. This is the first clinical trial in paediatric palliative care that we're doing. So it's children with advanced cancer. And we're using a CBD THC equivalent and a CBD dominant product. But again, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA, we got it all registered with those. There's absolutely no problem. There's a need for more information on Australia, and that is supported by our regulators. So in fact, the trial that we're doing is actually an MRFF funded, so Medical Researchers Future Fund. So it's a government funded grant to look at medicinal cannabis. So again, I think that's one of the reasons why it's been more smooth sailing from the regulatory side of it, is because this is something that they're actually asking for. As I say, incorrect information, things do change, and you do have other competing priorities. So Anthony's a busy working clinician. He's a palliative care consultant. I work on other projects as well as taking on this lovely role of getting this trial up and running, which we're hoping will be the beginning of July if I can get the work done before I return to Australia whilst I'm here. So yeah, I guess it's being aware that, you know, you can have these ideas, but there are lots of things that stop you, but you also have to remember the positives, and there are a lot of positives with it. Is that one of the main drivers to keep going and sort of overcome it and work with it is the purpose, you know, why we're doing this. We're trying to do this to determine if cannabis is safe for these children to have and if it actually helps their symptoms. So that's one of the key things that keeps us going. We're trying to improve outcomes where we can for children. There's not a lot of evidence. There's more prescribing happening, but we don't actually have the evidence to support whether or not these children should be having it. There's been fantastic collaborative opportunities, you know, standing here today because of one of those reasons, you know, invited over by Lauren. We also have great opportunities to collaborate with our other universities in Australia, University of Queensland, who are doing some actigraphy work for us. And the Lambert Initiative have been absolutely fantastic in supporting us as well. As I say, we're all new to this sort of cannabis space, but we've been really fortunate that we have had other people that can help us through some of the hurdles. The Marta is one particular hospital that has been helpful. So Janet Hardy and Philip Good, they've been doing medicinal cannabis trials in the adult population, and our protocol is actually based off the work they did. So they've been really supportive with helping us there. And I guess one of the big things is that skill development and expertise. So I am now the clinical trials expert at the university, which can be a bit scary, but it's really helpful, and it's really nice to be able to share your experiences. So other people that are looking at doing cannabis trials in the adult population and in different diseases come to me now, and I'm like, okay, don't do this, do this, do this, don't do this, don't do this. And I think it's about that sharing, and what we're all here today to talk about, that sharing and that collaboration and what we can learn from each other is such an important thing, because it is kind of a small kind of out there space in many ways. And I think the more that we can bring together our learnings and what we're doing and sort of what doses and what, you know, cannabis products we're using is actually going to help, you know, build this better profile of the safety of it, and also of, you know, the effectiveness, I guess.
Save all of your questions, because we're going to go right into the next panel. Thank you, Alison. Yes, I'll introduce you at the mic. So next we're bringing up Dr. Bruce Crooks, who is one of our C4 team members, and he's an associate professor of pediatric hematology and oncology at Dalhousie University and IWK Health in Halifax, Nova Scotia. His practice involves caring for children with cancer and rare blood disorders, focusing on neuro-oncology, stem cell transplantation, retinoblastoma, and histocytic disease. His interest in cannabis-related medicine stems from his interest for his patients and families brought to the team in their potential role to care for children with cancer and other diseases. He aims to help provide good quality evidence for the role of medical cannabis for children and to develop good education. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you very much, Lauren. It's a great privilege and a pleasure to stand here in front of you. And as a pediatrician, I get the ability to wear a Simpsons shirt. And it was serendipity that you had a Homer Simpson there. And it also means that I can wear shorts and play with a yo-yo as well, because that's fine. And we know the role of play, which is really, really good. And putting my yo-yo away, because I will play with it. So thank you very much for bringing us here. The reason I'm kind of wearing this Simpsons shirt is that this is me. This is this little Bart Simpson here that you can see. But if you look at the back of the shirt, and I'll carry on talking and hopefully you can still hear me, you have the whole of the cast of The Simpsons. So you have so many different characters from so many different backgrounds, each with a very, very different story and a role to play. And those are really my patients and their families. And with my colleague, Dr. Rod Rasek, who's sitting in the audience as well, we kind of do coast to coast because he's on the West, I'm on the East, and we kind of run similar parallel practices. My interest in helping families with cannabis-related medications in pediatric hematology and oncology really stems from patients asking, which is really where most of us have actually arrived today. And it was particularly a family, it was about 10 or 11 years ago before regulations changed and everything, and their child was dying of leukemia, and they wanted to try a cannabis-based medicine because they'd heard from parent support groups and things that this was useful and might help them child. At that point, you clutch at straws. People who've been in that situation, you will do anything to help your child. You will do anything if it's a possibility for cure. Now, it split really our department and our division because there was a lot of people that argued that this was something that we couldn't possibly do. There was no framework for us to actually bring a cannabis-based medicine into the hospital because there were no regulations and it wasn't legal. And it was before the law changed, et cetera, et cetera. But then the other side of the argument is, my child is dying anyway. What harm is there in trying this? And we want to do this, we want to do it. In the end, they actually took their child home and they got cannabis from somewhere, I don't know where, but it was black market, and they tried it. It didn't alter the outcome, but it helped and it gave that family help and support, reassurance and hope. And I think a lot of us in this room are by no means experts on pediatric cannabis medicines because really, the information, the evidence is not there. We really don't know what we're doing with these medicines because we know so little about them. I'm actually supposed to have some slides here. And there are a lot of questions that are asked by my families. They come, and some of our families, they come in armed with a Google's sort of search of information about their cancer or whatever else it is or anything like that, including information on cannabis, including will you sign this authorization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Other people come to it and they go, well, we've heard about it, or there's a problem. And they say, do you think this might help? So people come to it from a whole variety of different areas. And that means that you actually have somebody who's supposed to be able to answer those questions for them, somebody who they trust, that knows and can give them some reasonable advice. That person happens to be me. Rob seems to be the person in Vancouver for it. And so you kind of take that role upon yourself. And that's where I came from for this, to educate myself, because there really isn't a lot of education out there. There is now, but there isn't a lot of education when we started this journey out. And so I had to learn what I could about cannabis. I had to learn about regulations, et cetera, et cetera. And if somebody comes to me with questions now, and my colleagues refer, I sit down and I'll go, okay, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about it openly because that's what we should do. But you're going to have the talk about the pros and the cons, and it's really shared decision-making as to whether or not a cannabis-based medicine is something that we should or could use for you and your child and your family. And so some of the questions are, will it cure my cancer? We really don't have any evidence for that, but a lot of people do believe that. Will it help with my nausea and vomiting? Yes, it can do, but it doesn't work for everybody. Will it help with anxiety? Yes, it can do, but again, it won't work with anybody. Will it help with pain? It may do. Will it help with other side effects in palliative care, et cetera, et cetera? It can do any of those things. The additional things are the practical questions. What should we use? What product am I going to do? There's all these products out there. If you just go onto a licensed producer site, there's a shopping list like this long, and they're going, where do we start? What is all this stuff? They have no information about it. How much should we use? What's your bud tender going to give you? What's that going to tell you? Where do we get it from? How much will it cost? What are the legalities? There really is only one route for pediatrics, and that is the medicinal route, because it's illegal to supply from recreational or black market sources. And so really, through me or one of my colleagues is there. The other thing is that some of my colleagues have had conversations about medical cannabis, but then at the end of the line, the families say, well, will you give us an authorization? Oh, no, I won't do that. You're going to have to go to somebody else. That, I think, is a dereliction of your clinical duty. And so you should put your money where your mouth is and say, if I'm having this conversation, it's up to me as a responsible clinician to give that authorization, but to do that under medical supervision. If this works, as I'm watching you, then that's fine. If it helps, we will carry it on. If it's not, I'm going to recommend you stop it, etc., etc. But then there's not only those acute kids that come in and they're in active treatment. There's also the kids that are using it either recreationally, they're using it at school, they're using it for their other medication, etc., etc. And how do you have those conversations about how you're still going to use that whilst doing the rest of your treatment, because they're not necessarily using it medicinally, or maybe they are, but then there's also the kids that are using it recreationally. And I mean, there's another anecdote. There was one of our kids, this was an interesting one, and it was a kid, he was vehemently anti any sorts of drugs, any sorts of opiates, anything. He was 13, 14, whatever else it is, he was coming in with his cancer. And his side effects were very, very severe. And in the end, he said, I'm going to try cannabis. I said, well, I can have this talk. And he says, no, I've got some and I'm trying it at home. And he went home and he tried it. And he rapidly escalated into a very, very severe cannabis use disorder. He was smoking shatter. He was doing all sorts of things. Basically, his usage was out of control, but it was up to me to have those conversations and to help him to actually do this. Cut forward a few months, he finished his treatment and we have the bell ringing ceremony. You've got to love the bell ringing ceremony. And it was finally at the end of COVID so that we could have a bell ringing ceremony. So everybody assembled. He's 14. The last thing he wants to do is a bell ringing ceremony. So he's standing there going, and so he comes up to it and he stands there next to the bell and he goes, ding, there you go, I've done it. And his mum's, oh, she's so pleased and very excited. And we're standing there afterwards, all the nurses and everybody has gone away and there's just the family standing there. And so I said to him, I said, that was really, really nice. And he rolled his eyes. And I said, but I'm really disappointed. And he looked at me and says, why? I said, well, when you rang the bell, it didn't go bong. At which point his eyes rolled so far into the back of his head that they dropped out of his bum. And his mum lost it and she was laughing. The nurse was laughing. You can have fun with this as well. You realize that it's a real part of somebody's life, but you have to have those real world conversations. And really, I am not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination, but I am a committed clinician who is willing to have those conversations to actually further this and to actually try and gather some real world evidence to help in this world where we have a drug that is available and anybody can get hold of it at any time, but we have very little science to back it up. And that's what really we're all about here. So that's my position, and bad jokes aside, that's what I'm here for. And thank you very much for listening.
Looks like we even got the right one up next. So I'd like to welcome up Mafanwe Graham next. She is a Fulbright Scholar, alumna in medical cannabis and health policy, and an associate lecturer in medical education at the University of Newcastle, and a non-resident fellow at the University of Southern California. Her research explores the intersection between multinational medical cannabis policy, use patterns, and patient outcomes. As an associate investigator with an NHMRC Center of Research Excellence on Cannabinoids, Mafanwe collaborated to develop a suite of Australian state government-funded medical cannabis prescribing guidance documents, something I know we're all very envious of here in Canada. Mafanwe is also the principal specialist medicines information pharmacist on the Australian state government-funded medical cannabis advisory service that operated from 2018 to 2022. Methano works with researchers, regulators, policymakers, and health professionals in North America, Europe, and Australia to support progression of medical cannabis research, inform health policy decisions, and translate research evidence into health professional educational initiatives. So, welcome.
Okay, so we've heard from trialists producing the evidence. We've heard from clinicians at the coalface utilizing this in clinical practice. So one of the prevailing, I guess, topic areas where it's commonly noted that there's a lack of information is guidance for health professionals, and how do we engage health professionals, and how do we support them in having these patient conversations from a patient perspective, enabling them to be open about medical use. So I guess in Australia, we're very lucky in that not only have we had federal and state government funded trials, but we've also had engagement from both levels of government in terms of building educational resources for health professionals. And I'll talk to you a little bit today as part of, aside from my research hat, part of my knowledge translation body of work, where a state government funded the production of prescribing guidances. And one of the components of the prescribing guidance was detailing drug interactions and making them digestible for health professionals so they can engage with patients and have evidence-based conversations around this space. So my disclosures are, my funding is from academic, so institutions and government. So we already know that we have a large number of patients using non-prescribed cannabis for medical purposes and prescribed products as well. So this increases the likelihood of potential interactions, particularly, and I'll talk to you today specifically about cannabidiol. But one of the things that is really important to note is that around the world, we have evidence sources that we could be drawing from in facilitating these discussions that patients want to have with clinicians, and supporting clinicians in having those discussions and giving them evidence-based guidance. So one of the ways in which we've done this is production of guidance documents, but also publication in scientific literature as well. This particular guidance was published late last year in the Expert Review of Clinical Pharmacology, and it details cannabidiol drug interaction considerations specific for prescribers and pharmacists. So I'm not going to go too much in depth in terms of general considerations, because I want to make this presentation accessible to everyone. But there's a number of different, I guess, patient-specific considerations, particularly in pediatric and young adult cohorts, in terms of their pharmacokinetic differences to adult populations and their level of risk of drug interactions. We have detail about both pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic interactions and the mechanisms by which they may occur, but there's a lot of detail there. So what I wanted to present to you today is some specific examples of pediatric and young adult trial and case studies which have been reported in published scientific literature. And what's really interesting to me here is, despite the underrepresentation of pediatric populations in clinical trials, a large quantity of our published case reports and trial data around drug interactions involve pediatric and young adult patients. So that's really important. These are vulnerable patient groups, and it's really important that the knowledge we have is translated into a digestible format for clinicians. So a few examples here. There's been a small study of citalopram and escitalopram, which indicated there may be elevated citalopram concentrations. And part of what we did here is develop guidance around how this could be managed in clinical practice. So TDM refers to therapeutic drug monitoring, where it's available, and for the compounds in which it's available at different sites, specific sites. And essentially it means that we want to monitor the concentration of a specific drug and make sure it's within a certain range. And we've noted where some of these drug interactions could be managed via dose adjustments and so forth. Another example is fluoxetine. There's been a case report. In this specific example, it's thought that a particular CYP2D6 genetic polymorphism may be involved. And again, here's situations where we know that genetic testing is not always accessible. And so here it's something where we need to be aware of it for clinicians and health professionals so that clinical monitoring is in place for patients taking cannabidiol and medications where this may occur. Further examples. So I note that some of these examples were included in the earlier presentation, so I might skip through one so I don't replicate, but just noting that we've got a variety, for example, with everolimus, we've got a variety of different publication types. So not only do we have case reports, but we've also got retrospective reviews here. Again, additional clinical guidance, we might be considering laboratory and clinical monitoring, and in addition to dose adjustments to be able to manage these particular drug interactions. We've had case reports for both lithium and methadone. Again, these are pediatric patients and young adult patients, and so forth. And so again, essentially, these are examples where the concentrations of different medications have been impacted by a combination with cannabidiol, and in some circumstances, this has resulted in adverse events. One particular area where we have a little bit more information on drug-drug interactions with cannabidiol is for anti-seizure medications. And here, all of the examples I provide to you have involved pediatric and young adult populations. Notably, the clobazam example was provided in the earlier presentation. And here, alongside clinical monitoring, dose adjustments may be needed to be able to manage that. We have some instances where a drug interaction may occur, but so for example, the drug may not go outside of the therapeutic range. So here we might implement something like clinical monitoring to be able to manage that drug interaction in a clinical practice setting. And additionally, I'll use the valproate example. So not only do we have higher quality trials here, but we also have open label trials and systematic chart reviews. So notably, things like liver function testing implemented at baseline 1, 3, and 6 months can be used in the management of the combination of these particular medications. Additionally, there's been some evidence in pediatric populations of thrombocytopenia, so platelet monitoring may be implemented. So here's where our knowledge around pediatric and young adult populations is really important. It's being reported in the scientific literature, and it's really just making that information available in a format which is appropriate for health professionals so that they're aware of it, that they can monitor, that they can implement all of these strategies to be able to manage the drug interactions in clinical practice. So in summary, most CBD drug interactions can be monitored by a combination of different factors. So first being clinician and pharmacist knowledge and education around the potential drug interactions to enable them to prospectively identify and manage them. Clinician prescribing guidance is essential. Patient counseling, so that ability for a health professional to engage with a patient and have an evidence-based discussion around use and monitoring thereafter if a cannabinoid is trialed. Dose adjustments can be implemented, prescribing changes can be implemented, and therapeutic drug monitoring is important for particularly narrow therapeutic index drugs where relevant. So bringing this forth, one of the things I did with looking at different guidance as part of my Fulbright fellowship was to essentially scope out what international guidance existed in this particular space. So looking across all countries and looking at what information was being provided to health professionals, because there's a lot of, I guess, a lot of the kind of summaries of different presentations and different, I guess, research webinars and so forth is like, we need to educate clinicians. So I was looking at what's out there. When we compiled this particular paper, one of the particular deficits that was noted is there is a lack of pediatric guidance. So pediatric guidance may form a small component of some international guidances, but this is a knowledge gap or a space that we need to fill. And I think the collective multinational collaboration can help achieve that. So here's my details if you'd like to connect. And I look forward to our discussion.
Ooh, 2 for 2. There we go. Okay, so next up, we're welcoming to the stage Trinity Lothian. She is currently completing her honors in Bachelor in Food and Nutrition Sciences at the University of Ottawa and will graduate in 2024 as a registered dietitian. She's also a Team Canada peer fencer and competes internationally in wheelchair fencing. She's been involved in research and as a patient engagement for several years and has been a member of our youth advisory committee at C4T since 2020.
Thank you so much, Lauren. So I'll be presenting about the youth perspective, specifically for cannabis education and research needs. As Dr. Shiel stated, this is one of the unique opportunities where the patient community really does know a lot more than the physicians. So it's really important to include the patient voice and youth voice in your research and also knowledge translation. So a bit about youth engagement in research, specifically with C4T. So with cannabis research, you really want to involve youth in the research from start to finish, and we'll go over a bit of what the timeline of involving youth can look like in your research. And this really ensures that the study is beneficial to patients, because if you're just a bunch of adults working together, you haven't had the recent youth experience to know how you want to recruit youth, how the study should be designed to keep youth in the study, and then to go through knowledge translation. And it also allows real-time feedback for everything on study design. So working with C4T, we review all the consent and assent forms, all the different surveys that the patients do and participants in the study. So it really gives them the feedback on how things can be tweaked. And if you're interested in engaging patients in your research, there's 2023, there's so much online that's available within Canada, within Ontario, that you can just do a quick Google search, and it's never been easier. So you don't have an excuse to not engage patients. So then talking back to the timeline of youth engagement, so really this is from start to finish. So again, as Allison was kind of saying, it's not really a linear process. A lot of these things can happen at similar times, but really you want to engage youth partners, patient partners, family partners from the funding application. So especially these days, they always want a lot more people with lived experience on the funding application. It really will strengthen your application to have the letter of support from a youth partner. And then study design. So again, we can help with the determination of outcomes that are important to patients. So whether you want to add secondary outcomes to your studies, you might have in mind something that most patients might not exactly find to be the most relevant to them. So you might need to just tweak something there, and we can fix it and give that feedback as the study is being designed and not later on in the process. And then also review the participant materials. And then when it comes to recruitment, I'll touch a bit more on that in a bit, but really to go through the best practices for that and engaging youth, especially if you want to use social media to do it and to find your youth that way. There's lots of different ways to do it. And as youth, we can advise on where we would find a reputable study to participate in. And then finally, once you get to knowledge translation and you're wrapping everything up to the participant population, specifically if you're working with youth, you're not going to be sharing the results of the study by just sending them a link to the article that you published. They're not going to understand any of that. So just finding clear ways to share the information with the general population and your participant population is where youth partners can really come in handy. And then specifically in the pediatric population and specifically with cannabis research, there are a few special considerations that makes working with kids a lot different than working with adults, as we all know. So the first thing here is the use of subjective versus objective quality of life measures. Oftentimes, if you're doing research in the adult population, it's not too difficult to ask them on a scale of 1 to 10 to rate their sleep or to rate their pain or to rate just their quality of life in general. But if you're working in a pediatric population, specifically with kids who might be nonverbal or kids who are younger, you can't really do that. So this is where objective measures really come in handy and can be really useful, because for this you can ask them or ask their parents the amount of school days that they miss, the extracurricular activities that they're participating in, whether this is more or less, and you get the hard numbers from that are really useful for your research. And then the second thing here to focus on in the pediatric population is the compensation for the participants. So for this, the participants might not necessarily be interested in the same thing that adults would be interested in. So for here, it's usually things like gift cards and giving them a choice between a variety of different gift cards to pick from, because not all kids would want a gift card to a bookstore, for example. So to give them a variety of different options. And then also with this compensation to focus on the caregivers as well, because they are coming to the appointments, they are paying for parking, paying for gas or their mode of transportation. So to focus on that too, it's really a double, because all of the participants will be coming to their appointments most likely with a caregiver. And so then this brings us to caregiver involvement. So the kids participants will have their caregivers with them, whether that's a parent or someone else. And so when you're scheduling appointments or clinic visits around the research study, you're really needing to focus on 2 schedules instead of just 1, because someone will be needing to take time off work or take time away from other commitments that they might have. And so that's just another unique consideration for this population. And then specifically with cannabis is the medication administration. So whether it's an herbal extract or something like that, the one thing that you really need to focus on is timing. If it's something that you want to have taken at a specific time each day, kids and teenagers will have different schedules and also might not be the most compliant with that, especially if they're not understanding why they're in the study completely and the importance of taking it at the same time each day. So for example, for a teenager, taking their herbal extract at 8 a.m. on a weekday might work great because it's right before they go to school and it's perfect. But then on a weekend, they're going to be sleeping in most likely. They might not want to be taking their medication and waking up early just to take something that they just see as an obligation to take. So that's something that you do want to consider and ensure that they know and can understand really that it's something that's helping them and to go beyond the fact that it's just an obligation. And then also with acceptability, the herbal extracts might not taste the best, especially to kids that have different palates than an adult palate. And if kids also don't understand the necessity of them taking it, if they're nonverbal or have more complex care needs, then it's really important to make sure that it has an acceptable taste for them and an acceptable mode of administration for them that also makes it easier on their caregivers so that taking it doesn't become a huge hassle for the family. And then finally, with the pediatric population here in Canada, typically age out when you're 18. And so oftentimes when you participate in studies, you do get lost, even if the study's over, you do get lost to the follow-up and you don't get to hear about the results. So just really taking care to really focus on following up with the results from the patients and having a way to connect with them afterwards if that's something that they're interested in. And so then moving on to more of the recruitment and knowledge translation, one of the big things that as youth partners we've worked with C4T with is to focus on going away from social media for recruitment, because as youth, if we see an ad on social media for a study recruiting for cannabis, it's not something that we would perceive as being the most reputable thing. So oftentimes researchers, without having youth involved, might think, oh, social media is going to be the perfect way. All these youth are on social media. It's how we'll grab them. But oftentimes, if youth who are taught to use critical thinking skills see an ad for something specifically a study using cannabis, it might raise some red flags. So there are better ways to do this that I'll go into. So when talking with youth, the methods that really are preferred to get information about studies and about the results from studies are direct contact, whether this is from physicians or people in clinic or other trustworthy sources like friends and family. So for younger children, for them, this looks like their parents and doctors. And then for youth and teenagers, for them, it looks like parents, doctors, and the internet. So this is where social media might come in handy, but it's still not the most reputable source. So this is where there's a really high need for more child-friendly resources, whether it's something in clinic that you can share with your younger patients and just give them the resources directly to a reputable site that is on the internet, but that you know you have vetted and can send to them. But currently in the realm of medical cannabis, this really, if it exists, let me know, because as C4T, we haven't found anything specifically that works for younger kids and older kids alike. So there is a very high need for this. And so then moving forward with involving youth in research is just to know that pediatric cannabis research is a team effort. And so part of that involves including youth and families on your research team. And as you all know, because they're not just tiny adults, they require completely different considerations than working in the adult population. As well, patient decision-making does not happen in a vacuum. There's lots of different factors and inputs that go into this. So you as a clinician or researcher are just one of these parts that go into the decision-making behind the scenes that a patient has to take. So just to be aware that there are other effects going into that. Also, I didn't touch on this too much in the presentation, but we all know that there's a lot of stigma surrounding cannabis use and medical cannabis use, even in 2023. So just the more knowledge that we have about this and the more youth who are participating in the research, the less stigma there will be. And then that just creates the opposite of a vicious cycle and everything works out better. And then finally, the future of cannabis research is bright. Lauren has said this a lot. We have so many great people working with us and great people in the room that it's only going to go up from here.
As always, Jim, thank you so much. Wrestle it back in here. Okay, the last of our short presentations, and then we're going to open the floor to some discussion and some questions, is from Matt Hughes. So Matt Hughes is the co-founder and director of MidCan Support, a hub for education, advocacy, research, and support for the use of prescribed cannabis in pediatrics. Matt has been involved with the UK medical cannabis sector since early 2019, when his son Charlie was prescribed cannabis for the treatment of severe treatment-resistant epilepsy. Charlie has seen a dramatic reduction in his seizures and a much improved quality of life. And Matt continues to campaign and advocate for population-wide NHS access for children suffering from severe epilepsy and be a voice for patients and families with the growing private cannabis sector, joining the executive committee for the UK Cannabis Industry Council. And I'm going to now mute my mic so that we can hear you, Matt, loud and clear.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's an honour to be here today. So as Lauren's already mentioned, my name is Matt Hughes. It's MedCan Family Foundation. We've converted to a charity. We work on behalf of families across the UK who are looking for information and education around cannabis-derived medications. We support them through access with funding, amnesty and data. As mentioned, it's access campaigning for NHS-wide access. The NHS here in the UK is free to us, but currently the only access is Epidiolex, which is licensed medication. Many of our families are using unlicensed cannabis. These are broad spectrum and full spectrum medicines, as well as Epidiolex or Epidiolex in conjunction with THC oils. Funding, a lot of these families are paying a huge amount of money privately for these medications. We're trying to help them support, because they can't afford the cost of supporting their child with other disabilities, equipment, hardship grants, that type of thing. Amnesty, no judgment, without access, families are resorting to poorly regulated over-the-counter oils and illicit products. And we're seeing a huge increase in that, far more than there are prescribed. And data, we work alongside Drug Science, which is a UK charity here, and also Flora, who are a technology company. We've recently launched a observational study looking at all the families that are prescribed an array of oils. Those are using over-the-counter as well and illicit. It's using an app which is available on Android and Apple. And yeah, we're just trying to grab as much data on efficacy, safety, and quality of life improvements. We've been working in collaboration with Evan Lewis, who's in the audience at the moment. And yeah, it's only just started, but we have already begun to recruit. Barriers in the UK, it's difficult. We're many years behind the rest of the world at the moment. So we have governing guidance from the National Institute of Healthcare and Excellence and the British Pediatric Neurology Association. There's a big push for randomized controlled trials. As yet, I'll come to this in a little bit, but these have not yet started. Domestic supply isn't there other than Jazz Pharmaceuticals, so we're reliant on imports of unlicensed medicines, which has an impact on the supply chain. There's also a huge lack of education, and there's a fear of prescribing. The UK currently only has one neurologist prescribing privately. So to put that in context, although there is prescribing within the NHS of Epidiolex, in 2021, there were only 200 prescriptions of Epidiolex, and they were only in Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. So that a huge number of families have zero access, zero support, and if they look into cannabis, they go to illicit sources. So that's partly why MedCan MedCan Foundation came about. We're there to be a central hub within the UK that families can come to get the right information, that we can gather the data, and we can start supporting moving forward with clinical trials. So how did the law come about? So this is Alfie Dingley. So Hannah Deacon, mum to Alfie, we're very good friends and colleagues, and we co-founded MedCan Foundation together. Hannah also runs the Medical Cannabis Clinician Society here in the UK, supporting, I think it's around 500 clinicians. So Alfie has PCDH19, and yeah, nothing was working for him. They wanted Epidiolex at that time, it wasn't available. And so they took Alfie to Holland and yeah, had access to a whole full spectrum oil prescribed, and it reduced his seizures. And then over time, he became seizure free. Hannah then brought Alfie back home, and a huge campaign was launched, and that led to the change of law here in the UK in 2018. So as mentioned, the National Institute of Healthcare and Excellence, they do not routinely recommend unlicensed medicines other than Epidiolex. And the National Institute of Healthcare Excellence guidance is Epidiolex is used in conjunction with clobazam. It cannot be prescribed on its own accord. However, NICE do now recognise the weight of real-world evidence, and there are new initiatives to look around the use of real-world evidence in pushing forward clinical trials. Now, last year, the UK was behind many other countries in licensing medicines for the NHS, and the government are now trying to push forward in new innovative ways, innovative technologies to advance access to rare diseases, of which obviously epilepsy is one of them. British Pediatric Neurology Association, again, they've acknowledged that more evidence is needed in the form of randomized controlled trials. They only recommends pediatric neurologists prescribe licensed medicines. Obviously, that's only Epidiolex. And their criteria to prescribing unlicensed medicines is that a child has proven intractable epilepsy, has failed the ketogenic diet or not be an option for them, and has not responded or not part of brain surgery or has been through the brain surgery route. Despite that, sadly, the reality is that families haven't met that criteria. Children are still suffering, up to hundreds of seizures per day, still not able to access cannabis medicines. Even Epidiolex is unavailable to them. So randomized controlled trials, there are talks of several trials here in the UK. There's one in particular which is being led by the British Pediatric Neurology Association and Professor Helen Cross in conjunction with the University College of London. It's to look at two trial groups and in comparison. So it's a CBD versus a placebo, and then a CBD and a THC mix versus a placebo, and to ascertain whether THC brings any benefit to seizure control over just CBD as an isolate. Unfortunately, this has been in the making for 2 years now, and they're still only at the point of trying to find a product to run the clinical trial. There has been discussions around the use of an observational trial, especially for families like ours that are already using unlicensed cannabis medicines and have been for many years. It's really, really sad to see that there's very little data being gathered on this. There's a lot of concern over THC in the developing brain, and none of this data is being collected at the moment. So yeah, the observational study was not approved. They felt it wouldn't add to the current evidence that's been available across the world. Domestic supply, as mentioned, we have Jazz Pharmaceuticals, who obviously produce Sativex and Epidiolex. Other than that, the domestic supply here is slowly coming forward. We are working with a producer here in the UK who are looking to focus on epilepsy and potentially running clinical trials within the NHS for full spectrum products. But the supply chain is ultimately imported products at the moment. These are from Australia, from Canada, and from Israel. Unfortunately, this does lead to issues around quality control, consistency, and availability of formulations. Now, all products imported have to be to GMP standard. Unfortunately, and this impacts my own son, Charlie, he's been prescribed an oil for the past 3 years from Israel. It's remarkably improved his seizure control. He's been predominantly seizure-free for the past 2 years. And the delays, his quality of life has significantly improved. He's doing really, really well at school. His attendance is brilliant. And although he's got global development delay, he's non-verbal, he's unable to walk, but he's hitting milestones in his own way. So things that we wouldn't have thought he'd be able to reach, he's beginning to reach them. So these delays in supply also impact families having to change oils at moment's notice. There's zero communication to them. So it's at last moment that they get told that supply is not there. So sorry, going back to the Israeli oil, that's now been halted. That's no longer be available to the UK. So us as for Charlie, we're now being forced to look at another alternative. And sadly, looking at the range that we have available in the UK, there's nothing anywhere near the same ratio or concentration of cannabinoids as what this oil had. Education is a huge problem here. So we have medical schools and universities, but we don't have a central national curriculum. The endocannabinoid system is only taught in a few institutions, and there's a huge lack of knowledge of cannabinoids in medicine. The BPA also state that doctors don't know anything about these treatments, that companies that produce in these unlicensed medicines or should be conducting the standard routine research. There's also a lack of confidence within families to speak with their neurologists and to push things forward. We have many families that are using illicit cannabis, they're seeing huge improvements to the point they're able to wean off their pharmaceutical medicines. But clinicians don't know about this. They keep it hidden, they keep it secret because of the implications and the risk of having their child removed. So they're going to their pharmacy, they're picking up their pharmaceuticals and then just throwing them in the bin. That is the reality, and that's what we're trying to work with and push forward and tell the epilepsy charities and really push this knowledge and tell everyone this is the reality of what's happening. Although there's a zero tolerance approach to prescribing unlicensed medicines, it's really impacting these children and these families, and they need support and we need prescribing. Dr. Evan Lewis, who's in the audience at the moment, he's been supporting us for many years now. We have various different guides for families to help them understand and for clinicians, and we work alongside the UK's Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society in teaching clinicians in cannabis. We have many nurses, physiotherapists who are all interested or hear about CBD or cannabis through the families. So it's getting the two to talk to one another and start breaking down these barriers, breaking down the stigma, the misunderstanding. A large part of what we've noticed, we've been running some focus groups with the general public to understand their perceptions of cannabis, and through that is the wording that we use, we've changed. We don't use cannabis anymore. So again, it's really understanding the wider public perception of cannabis as a medicine, and to really start legitimizing cannabis as a medicine in its own right. So this is a case study. So this is Adam. We've changed his features. This is using AI, but yeah, he's got some of his features, but because he's using illicit cannabis, we've changed his face. So Adam's 13 years old. He suffers 50 seizures a day. Traditional medicines aren't working for him. His doctors are now wanting to perform brain surgery, removing or severing the left cortex of his brain. The catch is, though, that would permanently damage his sight, meaning he'd lose the ability to read his beloved Magna comics. And at worst, there's no guarantee that it'll stop his seizures. His parents believe there's a better alternative. They'd love to try cannabis-based medication. In countries like Canada and Australia, these can be prescribed. Unfortunately, here in the UK, it's a zero tolerance, and it's the surgery that is being pushed forward. So for his parents, they're having to make a choice between their son losing his sight and not having access to to fight his seizure control, which may not even support his reduce his seizures. So in their desperation, his parents have resorted to cannabis oils from the black market. They don't know how effective it will be, but they strongly believe Adam deserves a chance to explore all available options before sacrificing his vision. So remember, these medications can be prescribed routinely in other countries. We're also running a campaign. So lots of these children are using illicit cannabis, and it's really important to push across that these families want clinical support. They want clinical advice. They do not want to be going to a drug dealer or someone down the road who thinks they know epilepsy or thinks they know cannabis. They really want these, to be overseen by their clinical consultant, and they're trying to talk with them, and these clinicians are turning their back on them, which is really sad to see. But it's a lack of education, and this is what we're trying to do: is fill the gap and push things forward. As mentioned, the data that's coming out of the UK, we've had a peer-reviewed paper to show that whole plant extracts, with the addition of THC, we're seeing further improvements in seizure control. And Dr. Evan Lewis, he recently came to the UK and we got to meet, and he presented his data from you guys over there in Canada. And again, it's particularly poignant to see that that data shows that THC, or the addition of THC, has a really good improvement in seizure control, to the point that I believe it's 7% or 7.5% in that population were seizure free. So this is really good data that really should be being pushed forward to advocate and allow these children, these families, to be supported and access these unlicensed medicines. That's it. Thank you, guys.
Excellent. Well, Zena pulls up the other questions. I have a question, and it's for the Australians, because we know there's like a whole lot of cannabis products available here in Canada, recreationally, illicitly, from your friends and family. So in Australia, I wasn't sure, are there products, are there whole plant products available? Like, how many kinds of products are available? What is the current landscape outside of maybe Epidiolex for families in Australia? Can we maybe start with just a little bit of a ground setting for that stage?
So outside of the registered products, Epidiolex and Sativex, there are over 300, what we term as unapproved or unregistered cannabis medicines available. So these need to meet GMP requirements. It's a variety of different dose forms. So oral liquids, for vaporization, capsules, or sprays, one edible, and so forth. So the diverse range of methods of administration, and a diverse range of cannabinoid compositions, ranging from CBD dominant to one-to-one formulations to THC dominant formulations. So these are accessed through an application pathway with the federal government to allow for use of an unregistered or unapproved cannabis.
And did I hear GMP vape, like plant for vaping?
So these products have to meet certain requirements where the composition is known, and also they need to meet requirements to show that they're free from contamination as well. So from July 1st, I believe, of this year, all imported products also need to meet those GMP requirements, not only like home manufactured products.
Excellent. And I'm going to ask Elizabeth the same question about the US and what kind of products are available. I guess this is going to range a lot state to state. Is there any regulated non-pharmaceutical products?
No, it's really regulated state to state. And if you look and see what the state requires, like Massachusetts is pretty tight. That requires pesticide testing, heavy metal testing, consistency testing, but some of the states don't require any of that. And the only registered product that's really is you don't even have Saturdays. And I think there's hundreds of different formulations available in the United States, hundreds. And a lot of my patients are still extracting their own.
And I know some of our Latin American colleagues are in the audience, so I was hoping I could ask Paula maybe just to speak to a little bit about your experience in Latin America. What kind of products are available there for kids? How is that working in the pediatric landscape?
Okay. They're from the same.
So hi everybody.
So I can speak to the northern part of South America from Colombia. We've had the medical cannabis regulation since 2016, but only the first products that came into the market around just prior to the pandemic, 2020. And we have a variety, as you do up here in Canada. It's basically a combination of CBD THC products, mostly because of regulatory needs for the producers. They're going to focus more on the CBD heavy products. Right now, there's only one company that is producing the 1-to-1 ratio that we know from side effects, but it's oral oil. And other than that, there are no flowers for prescription. We don't have to follow any GMP requirements. It is very much like an unregistered medicine. And as of January 1st of this year, some of the insurance companies are covering prescriptions for certain conditions. And I don't think there are any pediatric conditions, unfortunately, covered there. The only difference, though, we do have a registered product, an Epidiolex-like product that is covered by the government as well. That is covered also for pediatric refractory epilepsy, Dravet, Lennox-Gastaut, tuberous sclerosis. And I would say that since the government started covering some of that, those prescriptions as of this year, the uptake by clinicians has increased a little bit because obviously, as you know, if up here, it's really expensive for parents to be covering out of pocket for these medications. And the other situation that is a little bit different down there is that because of the reluctance that specialists have had engaging with medical cannabis and wanting to learn about medical cannabis, sometimes the care of these complex pediatric patients are actually left to cannabinoid specialists, quote unquote, who might not necessarily be, equipped or and trained to provide this integral, multidisciplinary care that these complex patients may require. So that is sort of like they're feeling a need for sure, but sometimes the care might not be, optimal in that situation.
Thank you.
If you go to Argentina and Uruguay.
Actually,
Sorry, can you maybe if you can just introduce yourself first? Yes, thank you.
From Uruguay. And I have the honor to be the president of the Society, Latin American Society for Cannabinology. We are integrating colleagues from medicine, biochemists, biology, etc. Because we think we need each other to build this knowledge seriously. And also I'm the director of the diploma at the National University, Autonomous University of Mexico, where we are trying to change this situation because everybody is saying that the colleagues are not prescribing. It's true. And they don't know, but we have to invade universities. We have to change curriculums. And the way to do that is being inside the universities, not only researching, but creating comprehensive curriculums. That's why we put together, we call our legends. We have more than 70 professors. All the names you already read the papers. So the situation in Latin America is not different. In our countries actually truly believe that your countries are doing better. And I know that it's not. Actually, in Uruguay, we have 8 products registered by the health ministry that can be prescribed legally. Unfortunately, maximum THC we have is 0.8 THC. But we have registered products that are GMP compliant, that have to be audited, etc. But the majority of the population in the whole Latin America, worldwide, are taking legal products, now or whatever, because they cannot afford. So it is not included, putting ahead in my country to be included in what we call the therapeutic formularium, that with all the products that are there must be subsidized, not only by public health, but also private. That, the institutions are pushing against that because it's not, it's complicated for them. And also to include cannabinoids in the legitimate cannabinoids. We legalized in 2013. We have 10 years legalized, full regulation. And we're still struggling with others. But I think that the situation is perverse. Why? Colleagues are not coming because there are no clinical trials, they're not evidence, but the industry is not supporting the research. And this is why my humble opinion is because the regulation, while they can sell the products without research, without registering, they will go on because they are really the same as the pharmaceutical industry. We have been criticized for decades. But the industry, the cannabis industry, is doing exactly the same. They are taking the money without giving back anything at all, even evidence-based knowledge. So that's the point. And while the governments are authorizing selling up products, who is going to pay research to register the products, and everybody is going to sell? Because I understand that democracy should be smarter, but this is the problem we have. Yeah. And we don't have regulated products. Pediatricians and all the other colleagues are not coming to this way. And so I think that we are together here is not as others, we have to work together to change through education and helping the colleagues to push ahead their health systems to change this reality, because our patients are doing better. It's true, but not always they can afford the treatment for long term, even with illegal products. And even that worse because they are having sick in Uruguay and Latin America, toxic pediatricians. Toxicologists, pediatricians, we are seeing serious side effects because they are self-medicating, because they are taking products. We are seeing really serious problems. Arrhythmias, hypocalcemias, even interactions are not taken into account. We have 7 classes in our diploma, is specifically to talk about interactions. Every chapter. Neurology, oncology, all the products have to be aware of the interaction. That's the way we can change, and people are changing this development. If we move ahead seriously, like this, that this is here, we are all agreeing. We need to invade. I'm sorry.
I like you. We just met, but we're going to get along great. Yeah. No, and you hit so many nails on the head. When 2018, when we launched this, there was about 6 different licensed producers that were all making GMP products and all going to invest in trials. And it was all going to, as they were launching their rec markets, they put, lots of research as their priority. And, we have a product now and a good relationship with the last standing, and now there is a bit of a swing where some of the companies are saying, oh, well, maybe whoopsie, maybe we should get into this space, but the investment from industry is not there because it doesn't need to be there. There's no incentive for them to make GMP products and there's no incentive for them to do clinical trials. So, it becomes this huge rock and a hard place where the academic community and the clinical communities are really left to answer almost all these questions, which is why I invited you all to help me. And yeah, Mike, did you want to add something?
We are sisters and patients, so we need to push ahead.
It's a question of comment. First, a question for our Australian friends. So when you say GMP products, does that require consistency of concentration? Because I know, like, for instance, in October last year, FDA pulled a whole bunch of CBD products off the market in the US because they found that CBD concentrations range from 0 to 110, 100 electrons or more in the first. So they actually guarantee concentrations. That's been our problem locally using recreational products. This gummy got 10 milligrams of CBD. Okay, it's got somewhere between 1 and 100. That's all I have. Is that something Australia?
So in Australia, we're talking about a predominantly medicalized model that's relatively tightly regulated. So in terms of composition, the composition of the product does need to match the labeling. There's nuances in batch to batch variation, but it's minor in comparison to what we see in the US. In saying that, there's publicly available audit results where the Federal Medicines Regulator has audited products as well. There were only a few products which were non-compliant, but again, they sequentially do this auditing process. So it's not like the North American context where you can go to a dispensary and you might not know what you're getting. However, I will note that even in this medicalized model in Australia, we have, there's been an increase in uptake over the past 5 years, but still the majority of patients are still accessing via non-regulated pathways. So here's where we have a great opportunity from a multinational perspective to all learn from each other, to collaborate, to see how we can move this space forward. Because there's strengths and limitations of each country's approach. We can all learn from each other.
Just have a comment for your friend about talking about education about cannabis. If they haven't done medical education for 30 years, the evaluation drives quickly. And the British have a unique opportunity because they're about the only country I know of that has a required prescribing exam for all the benefits and benefits. So if you can get listed, if you can get the drug listed and talk to British Pharmacology Society, which I'm a member of, if you put it on the prescribing skills attendant exam, they'll teach you the medicals. So I think there's opportunity to get that a lot of countries don't have by using the educational system. If we get it approved, if legislation approves its action.
Well, I think we're going to Ethan next, and then we'll come. And again, if you can introduce yourself quickly just before.
Yes, for sure. And another question for Dr. Graham. I wondered if you could help us. Perhaps this was in your published paper. Give us an idea of in the drug-drug interactions with CBD with these isolates for the doses. And the reason I ask is my most experienced colleagues in the States seeing children really aren't seeing these problems at low and moderate doses, particularly with broad-spectrum products.
So there's two elements I see here. There's the isolates and the broad spectrum products. There was a mix of both in published scientific literature, but what we were really aiming to do with this particular location was look at whether there was a dose threshold. And there's preliminary signs that there is a dose threshold for these drug-drug interactions. So dose is important. There's preliminary data around genetic polymorphisms being important, and all the other factors that we normally expect with drug-drug interactions. So I think this is an area where there's an opportunity for research in terms of isolates versus purified products, versus broad spectrum products. The thing is with the broad spectrum products, then we have other cannabinoids coming into play. And we do have data on these other cannabinoids also having potential interactions. So I think this is an area where we need more to be able to answer that question.
And maybe I can just follow up and then I'll go back to the audience because drug interactions and with a new medication, you would think this is something that, hopefully clinicians are typically monitoring for. So I guess my question is for the last two of you on the panel there is, lots of pediatric medicines are used off label and without indications and all kinds of things. So what is different about starting a patient on CBD or THC or medical cannabis authorization? Is there different things that you're monitoring about these patients, or if you're looking for drug interactions, is there anything different that you're doing when you start a patient on medical cannabis or CBD?
Maybe I'll go first from a Canadian perspective. The issue is that your patients are either going to self-medicate using whatever, or they're going to have an authorization from either myself or one of my colleagues or whatever else it is. But an authorization, you can make a recommendation onto what product you think that they should have. But then it's up to them to see what is also available. They can go to any of the licensed producers. They can get whatever product they actually want, depending on what the bud tenders are sort of advising them, et cetera, and what you hope that they're going to get and what they actually get, maybe two very, very different things. And a product from one LP is not equivalent to a product from the other LP. So what you have to do is you actually have to be very, very open and frank and to say, let me know what you're taking once you've got it, because this one might be really, really cheap because it's on a discount. This one might not, and you might change from this one to this one. And one of my patients has just done that, and I had to do a dose alteration, et cetera, et cetera. And the CBD to THC mixture may be slightly different, and so they may get some side effects. So you have to be vigilant in actually just sort of keeping tabs with them, sort of on a couple of weekly basis or a monthly basis and stuff. And you can even check in over the phone, or you can check in on a quick Zoom call or whatever else it is, just to see what's happening and to find out whether or not they're comfortable, what are the medications they're taking. So you can do a best medication history, and you can do a reconciliation and make sure that that's all right. But you actually have to be very, very open and upfront. And if everything's okay, everything's okay. But you have to have that vigilance, which is why I feel that if you're having the cannabis discussions with the patients, you have to be the person who's providing the authorization and doing the monitoring. You can't hand it off to somebody else, because I think that's a dereliction of your clinical duty. And that's the issue in Canada, because we only have Nabilo and we have Sativex. Nobody that I know uses Sativex. We all use Nabilo in the pediatric oncology world because it's available to us and it does work for some patients in chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and that prolonged nausea as well that we have. But we don't have Epidiolex. We have CBD enriched oils, but that's about it. So you have to be very, very careful and to watch them and just keep in regular contact with them. And it's that good clinical sort of acumen that we have.
And sorry, just to clarify, are you doing clinical monitoring, or are you doing like drug level therapeutic drug monitoring for looking like screening for drug interactions?
For us, pretty much we're not. I mean, I'm not doing a lot of drug levels, because most of the drugs that we're giving to them, you can't really monitor them, or if you are, you're actually monitoring them in-house, like methotrexate or whatever else it is. And you're probably not going to be giving CBD at the same time as you're giving high-dose methotrexate. That's not very good. But I mean, you can do certain drugs, but not all of them. And I'm not in the same field as neurology, where you're looking at these long-term anti-epileptic, anti-seizure medications and things like that. So, and our drugs are not usually long standing. We're giving these ones, then we're giving these ones, then we're giving these ones, and they're all over the place. And you're starting so many different drugs as well. So probably the only common threads are something like ondansetron and CBD.
So I would agree with everything. I think, in pediatric epilepsy, especially, or adult epilepsy refractory, our patients are on polytherapy. And even though my whole career is knowing how to manage drug-drug interactions, but CBD has been pretty working for us. And I tell everyone my next time I'm going to get a hepatologist, because it's extremely variable for patients depending on liver metabolism, et cetera. I think we're good, the neurology epilepsy community's gotten pretty good at it, but I think what we're not necessarily good at, and people outside are recognizing that the drug interactions and beyond the other anti-seizure medications, like the psych meds, like Everline, and you kind of here you have psychiatrists prescribing those medications, different physicians prescribing different medications. And I think that I find that I'm having to educate patients more than ever about just not about possible drug-drug interactions with the seizure meds, but if you are on citalopram and things happen, or fluoxetine, we had a kid go way up, and the psychiatrists don't usually follow those levels. So it's trying to just try to educate that. The everolimus is a real concern of mine, because lots of times the kids are being put on everolimus by nephrologists or whatever who aren't even thinking about the epilepsy, and that's a pretty potentially pretty toxic drug. And we had a kid whose citalopram level went from about 8 to 60 on a look after it again. So I think it's really a matter of educating, and I find it requires a lot of patient education. The other concern is the people who are using cannabis products without telling their physicians. There's still a lot of that because of the stigma, et cetera. We have a lot of people who come to us who haven't wanted to tell us, and then once you really cool with it, tell us, but that's not always true. And so I think that how you have that conversation with the patient that there could be this drug-drug interaction, you don't even know the patient is taking it. I'm sure that happens in psych, because I think a lot of people are taking cannabis products for sleep, for anxiety, for whatever, and they're also on citalopram, or on other medication. So I think it's really, unfortunately, it's got to be a patient community education thing as much as healthcare education, because they're the people who kind of know what they're taking more than they are helping. But yeah, I think it's a big thing that really needs a lot of education.
And Matt, I don't know if you can unmute, but I was wondering if you could speak to, I know they've changed some of the rules in the UK for starting patients on THC and CBD. And I don't know if you want to speak to how it's different in the UK, if Charlie was starting a new cannabinoid medication, is that policy changing around had to do some drug level monitoring? Maybe I'm misinterpreting the regulation changing or the guidance changes there.
Nothing's changed as such. It's predominantly the BPNA, obviously, with their concerns, especially over the THC. So they are the CQC, who are the Quality Care Commission. They are looking at more bloods, looking at monitoring the children that are prescribed cannabinoid or other full spectrum and full spectrum medications. So yeah, because of this, that we only have one neurologist prescribing currently. So just to put this in a bit of context, in the UK, we have over 250 medicines, predominantly flower. These are all GMP flower as well, and GMP oils. We have over 30 clinics, specifically cannabis clinics. And we have over 100 clinicians prescribing, predominantly for anxiety, depression, and pain in adults. So there's approximately around 25,000 adults being prescribed unlicensed cannabis medicines. There are less than 100 children, so it's around 50 children now that are prescribed unlicensed cannabis medicines. And again, as mentioned earlier, within the NHS setting, we have Epidiolex, which is available for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, Dravet, and tuberous sclerosis. But a Freedom of Information request last year showed that there were only 200 prescriptions within that setting as well. So within the UK, cannabis is in the pediatric community is barely touched. It's something that we're really trying to change and push forward. And like you mentioned earlier as well, a lot of the clinics and a lot of the producers, there are some that are looking to do clinical trials. We've got a couple with isolates looking towards cancers and sickness from chemotherapy. And a few others, but very few are concentrating in pediatric, and the vast majority have no intention of running clinical trials.
And you mentioned some data collection in the UK, and I'm just getting back to the drug-drug interaction thing, because I think, we don't know what we don't know, and how are people recording it in church that they're on cannabis so that the nephrologists and the psychologists know what the neurologists know, and that the families, when they do disclose, like that the other care providers know. So I wonder, from a parent perspective, are parents recording like the drugs that they're taking and how that's causing any changes in outcome? Like, is that something that's collected in sort of I know some of the parents that you work with are using that data collection tool. Is that something that could be tracked?
Yep. Yeah, we are tracking. So we take down all prescribed medications and alongside any unlicensed or illicit or over-the-counter products. So yeah, that is data that we're trying to gather and record any side effects. To be honest, it tends to generally only be Epidiolex that we're hearing of a drug interaction. I don't know if that's because clobazam and Epidiolex are prescribed together and they are administered together. Generally, with broad spectrum and full spectrum oils, it's advised to leave a gap to reduce that drug interaction.
Yeah, great. Sorry, there was another question in the room.
Just on the interaction, I think,
Can you speak into the mic just so the folks online can hear?
just on the interaction issue, I think that's really important what was raised. So in pediatrics, I think one of the big problems is to be blunt. Pediatric neurologists know drug interactions. Because we did a study maybe about 10 years ago, and the average in the first year of childhood development, like I said, the average child gets 7 different medications in Canada. I think don't suspect it's any different in the US. So neurologists know drugs interact with each other. Oncologists know some. Average pediatrician has no clue. So drug interactions with average pediatrician are an area of good degree, and they're not like adult doctors who recognize this. Polypharmacy is fairly new, but in the last decade, there's been explosion of polypharmacy, especially around psychoactive drugs. And it's very early time in most resident medical schools around pediatric drug interaction. So I think it's a big issue because outside of certain subspecialties, it's very underappreciated. Especially the fact that cannabis can have a drug interaction. Many pediatricians don't think it is a drug. So I think that's a problem.
I guess I just wanted to, oh, sorry, did you want to respond?
Yeah, carry on. I'll respond to that.
Should I go next?
You're up. You got the mic.
Moving away from the interactions for a bit, I was just mesmerized how much research is coming out of Australia. They're just keep, producing papers and just filling the gaps in several areas. So I just wonder, as a country, what pieces have been put in place for Australia to be able to support and carry out a lot of this research? And number two, if I'm allowed to ask a second question, how do you prepare your research ethics committees or IRBs or RADs to be able to undertake the challenge of reviewing clinical trials with cannabinoids?
Good luck.
And so I think one of the key things in Australia is that the CGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, they have their own guidance around cannabis for patients. So, and they're very open about what is and what isn't known. And that's something that sort of like it's supported at a government level. So, for example, the trial we're doing is government funded to look at medicinal cannabis. And I think that's one of the key things in Australia that's actually helping to move it forward is that it's backed by the government. And they want to learn more about what's happening. So they're aware that there's more prescribing going on. They're aware that, people will acquire cannabis through alternative sources, illegally or grow their own. And they're also aware that that's perhaps not the best option. So they want to make sure that their evidence is there to support patients who choose to take it and also clinicians who are making decisions for the prescribing. In relation to your other question around the ethics, we're fortunate where we went through in the children's there's other trials going on with cannabis in other patients and some neurodevelopmental disorders and also in the autism space. So our committee were quite familiar with the space. But again, in relation to that, it's providing the evidence that you have that's available, research to support it. I guess that was one of the key things when we go back to looking at the clinical trial application was that we were very open and honest in that there's no evidence, there is nothing to show for this population that we want to try it in. However, this is what the safety said that we know about, and this is how we can apply it to our population. And we were very clear around what we were hoping to achieve by that. So again, I think it's about honesty and transparency, and the whole reason around why we want to do it is for these reasons. And again, making sure that with your information that's in your consent, that you're very open with the parents about what we do and don't know. And that's what we're saying. So, people use cannabis, we know they use it, families ask for it, we don't know if it's how safe it is, we don't know what the optimal dose is, but that's what we want to try and find out. It may or may not work for your child, and we have this titration up, we have a maintenance dose, and we have titration down. And again, it's leaving the families to make that decision, but with as much information as we can to support them to make that. That's what the ethics committee is all about. They're looking at, you know, what are the risk benefits. And I say the big help in our perspective is that the federal level of government is supportive of this.
Before we move on, you talked about what, you know, what ethics boards might want to know. What would you want to know as a participant? What do you want to be told so that you're comfortable? Like, what is the information you need to make a decision about, yes, this is a trustworthy trial, or like something sketchy from social media?
I think that having the scientific information, like cite your sources, with exactly like what went on. And that way we can really assess the source and know, like, you see the things you know and the things you don't know, and then go from there, and you can decide based on what you already know if that's enough for us to go ahead with it. And that's a decision that everyone will make individually. For some people, they might go ahead with it without having the scientists already having like that much knowledge, but other people might want only to do the study once there's been a lot of information already published and already about the topic. So I think just being honest about it and sharing the knowledge that you already have where you got it.
Yeah, I think building trust in all of our trials, you know, this is a place with such stigma and history and such huge advancements that kind of keep coming. So I feel like sometimes I know what CBD does, and sometimes I'm like, oh God, I read a new paper, I'm totally confused now. And so I think being transparent and having some of those open discussions about, we still don't know how a lot of medications work. We know that they work, we know that they're safe. Do we know their mechanism? Not always. So yeah, that's helpful. If you can think of anything else to help give us trustworthy trials, that's always something we're interested in. Yeah, Bruce.
Thanks very much. And one of my big roles is actually enrolling patients on multiple clinical trials. And I mean, our institution, I mean, our particular division in pediatric oncology, we have something like 50 to 70 clinical trials open. And so part of our training that we give to our residents in our discipline is how to counsel and how to provide informed consent discussions. And you can never do 100% informed consent, because there's no way you can actually provide all that information, get everybody to understand all that information. So you actually have to provide understandable information. And the important thing is openness and transparency, and really ensuring that this is a voluntary participation and that there is no coercion in here, and to provide as much information and to allow a potential participant the ability to look at that information and to come back and ask you questions, and even to ask questions of a third party if they're concerned, etc., etc. But it's that overwhelming, it's that truth. And I always get the question, if this was your child, what would you do? And I mean, one of my answers to that is, I can't tell you what I would do because I'm not in that situation. But what I can tell you is that we have all looked at this, and we feel that on the basis of the science behind this, we feel that it is a scientifically reasonable thing to ask. And the important thing is clinical safety. So your safety is paramount on this, and that is the most important thing that we will be looking at. If we didn't think that it was potentially safe to do, we would never offer it to you. And those are some of the important things. And if you are a good clinical researcher, you have to be doing that. You can't be a cowboy in this.
I'm very aware that we have 15 minutes left, so I will take one more question, then I'm going to ask all of you one last question each.
I would like to come back to the interactions and side effects. And I think again, the history of this, how the grassroots history, how it came to the scene, is the timing of this going on. And I think our job is precisely to create new frameworks for this. For example, the clinical records should include not only during the education of the patient, before prescribing, you have to educate them. I'm teaching them that what could be the interactions and what could be the side effects. I do that. And I also follow like you. I have scheduled the monitor, clinical monitor. And when they don't come, it's generally when they don't come back, it's because they are having side effects. And they don't know, or they think that it was innocuous, you know, the innocuous herb, this romantic version, not romantic like the French novel, is the romantic like Baker, you know, so they are not coming back. They are living, so we don't have the side effects and the interaction in the clinic because they are not coming back with the information. If we don't do this actively. So I call them, listen, I have here, you should come back and tell me your information. Oh, well, Doc, you know, and that's it. This is one of the factors. And you pointed something that for me is very important. There's no bioequivalence studies. And people are changing from product because it's a full spectrum. What's a full spectrum? That can be 1,000 full spectrum differences. This is not the same if it's a full spectrum and it's working, so they are not similar products. So this misinformation is contaminating the clinical approach and also the beliefs and expectations of the patients. And this is very complicated. Pharmacovigilance has to be active. We cannot depend on the patient coming to tell us. We have to go to ask for them because they don't know what is an interaction. And they don't have to. But we have to look for, and we do clinical monitoring and also blood concentrations. With the pharmaceutical, the chemist faculty, we are studying that. And with the antibiotic medications, we find, and also immune treatments, we find a lot of interactions. And the patients are having some symptoms, and some of them are in risk, for example, transplanted patients, where the concentrations of the product is coming down because it's being induced the metabolism. Some of them can die. So that's why we have to learn to monitor it and detect very early in the evolution. So banalization of this story is having lyrics for the patients and also for us, because we have to turn back. This is a story what it should be. If these are medication, we have to deal with this the same way as with any other medication.
I totally agree. And that is kind of a excellent segue into the last question that I'm going to ask each of you to answer. And Matt, maybe we'll get you to answer it first. It's in this space where there's so much happening and so many different products and so little information. I want to ask each of the panelists, how can we collaborate? How do we move this space forward? What is, one actionable item that we can do to help move this space forward? And so Matt, I'm going to ask you your thoughts first, and then I'm going to go to Trin next and across the panel. So, when you're due.
I would say, from having spoken with people across the world in panels like this, is much closer international collaboration. I feel that there's so many similarities across Australia, UK, Canada, US. We really need to start putting together and collectively grabbing data. Obviously, some of these conditions are very rare. So to actually start working internationally, research coming together, clinicians coming together. Like I say, we've got a big issue here in the UK, having only one neurologist prescribing. He's very lonely. Evan's been amazing and been supporting us and supporting the clinicians as well. But we need more support, more help, more research. And in my personal view, is international collaboration.
Excellent. Trin, over to you.
So just to get more knowledge in this sphere, we're really working closer here in this group with a lot more like real world evidence and clinical trials, working directly with participants who are youth and children. And so really we're getting this evidence that will be applied directly to the real world. And so with that, we do need to keep engaging youth in research to make sure that the outcomes are actually the outcomes that will matter to patients. With lots of the epilepsy conditions and different versions to reduce seizures. Again, the measures are very objective. You reduce the seizures, great. But for other conditions, with quality of life and cancer care, chronic pain, neurodevelopmental, all those other issues, you really do need to keep consulting the patients for study design, consult with you to see what really matters with us, and that way we'll get research that will actually matter and be able to be applied to the real world, which is ultimately the goal.
And before we move on, when I think about things like reporting drug interactions and adverse drug reactions, well, like what incentives do youth have to report these things? Do they even know where to report them? Do they know what they should report? What are the consequences for reporting? I think there's so much youth engagement to do in this space globally around, you know, how do we get information to and from patients?
So I would really encourage the development of a multinational consensus of best practice pharmacovigilance and clinical trials in pediatric patients and young adults. I think the time has come for us to all collaboratively develop from the international context these vital frameworks to be able to move the field forward.
Did you just volunteer there? I think I heard a volunteering.
So I think like we are a group where we're coming from a number of different countries. We have shared experiences. We can come together and work on these projects together.
And we have all of your emails, so don't worry, you'll all get invited to join us.
I think from my perspective, it's the funding. We need more funding in clinical trials. Now, whether that be from the medicinal cannabis companies, I'm not quite so sure, to be honest. I quite like the approach that we have. I think it needs to come from a higher authority. So I think when it comes to the government and the investment is there, it shows that, you know, they want this to happen. And I think also that because we know there's been many cannabis companies come and go, in that, you know, we want to work with really good reputable companies also. We're very fortunate with the company that we work with. We partner with, they're supplying the product for us in kind during China, and also the special afterwards. So they're really invested into quality outcomes, and they're not able to influence the data they're collecting. I really think that's quite important in this space to make sure that it's unbiased and that we're getting true reflections of what these products do or don't do.
Thank you. I'm going to take a mile here and say two things. The first one is that I actually think that we actually have to push our producers to actually provide consistent and realistic products that we can actually use in a clinical and a trial setting, so that there has to be some mechanism to assure that we can get a product, we can test it, we know that it's going to be available, we know, etc., etc., and those are consistent sort of internationally, so that we can actually get a decent products which are real world products that we can actually use, because there's no way everybody's going to generate a Pediatric type thing or a THC equivalent. So I think we actually need to have decent products that we can test. The second one is that I think we should really push education about endocannabinoids and the actions of cannabinoid medications, etc., so that people can actually understand a little bit more and you actually have better knowledge within the entire region.
Great point.
I think I agree with everything that's been said. I think that we need a lot. I think epilepsy would work a lot, and, you know, I think the patient community aspect of that to me is really powerful. It goes beyond Epidiolex. There's actually been 3 international consensus meetings about cannabinoid medicine and epilepsy. And the striking thing to me is how very different things are country to country. And so now the actually International League Against Epilepsy has a plant-based medicine international committee that I'm on trying to assess that and try to gather the data on what's being used where. I think we need that kind of information on who's doing what, when, and how. You need education big time. I mean, big time about endocannabinoids, about cannabis, etc. We need to partner more with the patient community because the power of the patient community is impressive. There's clearly a desire in the patient population with epilepsy, pain, cancer, etc. And I think partnering with the healthcare societies to really say we need this information will hopefully lead to things like Australia's. I mean, you know, I think that there has been some interest in the United States, different funding mechanisms on doing this, but the costs are high and kind of how to do it like where we did trying to figure out we might know what to do. So I actually think there's a lot to be done, but I think at the end of the day, we're going to realize that there's a lot of therapeutic potential of the cannabis plant, and we owe it to everyone to kind of do what we can to figure that out.
Bruce has a third point.
I do. I'm going to take an extra mile. I think one of the other things is that we need to really strongly advocate for the depoliticization of this, because it's such a political hot potato. You can see in the UK that there's all wrapped up in the illegal drugs, etc., etc., etc. We actually need to push our political leaders to actually say, okay, we're actually going to take it out of this ridiculous situation that it's in, where you can do quite easily a load of research on opiates, which are far more dangerous drugs than cannabis actually is. But cannabis is such a big bugaboo that nobody else wants to touch. And so it really needs to be depoliticized.
I took it out. I put it in and then I took it out. The comment I make before I talk most of the time, which is like discussing cannabinoids in therapeutics for children should not be equated with suggesting every kid takes cannabis. So I actually took it out because I'm like, you know what, I really can't say it anymore. Like but I agree with you very much that these are separate messages and they need to be depoliticized for sure. Well, with that, I have a few last things to say, and then we are going to wind up, but feel free to stick around. So thank you for everyone on the panel. I think, this is something that like I said, was on our bucket list to get some international brains together, because really recognizing that this is not just a problem here in Canada and not just a, thing that's happening in epilepsy or oncology, but really an opportunity for us to come together and to start thinking, but bigger picture and about setting some standards. I love the idea of creating some actual guidance, like how do we study cannabinoids in children? How are we reporting pharmacovigilance? And back to Ethan's question about, products that have THC in them, people aren't reporting drug interactions because they're not even telling their doctor they're on them. Who are they going to be reporting these drug interactions to? And I think that there's lots we can do. And so just acknowledging that we do have, you see me and you hear a lot about me at C4T, but there really is a lot of partners and committees and members that make all of this work happen. I did want to say everything was recorded, so we will have it up on our YouTube channel and on our website. Please feel free to share it. And you can follow us along on Twitter or send us an email. And the big question is, this was the first pediatric special interest group meeting. Like, next year's in Spain. Maybe we are hopefully not our last special interest group meeting. And so really my last question is a question to all of you, is like, Spain next year? Yeah. Like, is this something that people are interested in? Like, we'd be happy to open up. So at C4T, we have monthly meetings. We are happy to invite you all to complete our conflict of interest statement forms and then come and join us at our monthly meetings. But I think that's one way, but I think getting everyone in the same room once a year might be a really good opportunity. And so I see Mel and Sarah have left the room, so I can't confirm ICRS would like us back every year, but I will do that. But I do think that it would provide a really good opportunity for us to come together, but also bring more people to the table as well, because it's great to see you all. And, there's lots of work we can do, online and on Zoom and all those things. But I do think that some of these things are just really good to share and learn from each other together. So thank you to all of our amazing panelists. And thank you, Matt. I know I'm not looking at you, but I'm thanking you as well, because it was really great to have all of your experiences. So thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us online.